Okay, so you're with us today for another deep dive. And this one is into a mystery. I'd say it still fascinates people even after, like 6 decades. The 1963 assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And as always, we know you guys are really keen to get informed as quickly and thoroughly as possible on these complex topics. And that's exactly what we're going to try to do today. We're going to unpack the latest developments, the recently released JFK files, and try to see, what new light, if any, they shed on this event and the questions that just, continue to swirl around it.
Yeah, that's right. Our goal is to really explore these newly declassified documents and, really alongside the established information that's already out there. So things like the Warren Commission's original conclusions, the numerous conspiracy theories that have emerged. We really just want to understand, how these new files contribute to our understanding of this moment in history. It's such a deeply impactful moment.
Yeah, and it's remarkable how enduring the public fascination is. John F. Kennedy was such a popular figure. And I think that the visual record of his assassination, especially that footage from Abraham Zapruder, it really seared this event into the collective consciousness. It's a moment that still feels incredibly present, even now, all these years later.
Absolutely. I think that visual element combined with the sudden loss of a young leader, someone seen as, inspiring, I think it all created this really powerful and lasting impact. It unfolded in such a public way. Yeah. And that undoubtedly, contributes to the ongoing interest and all those questions that you mentioned, that remain.
Okay, so let's kind of get into it. Go back to, I guess you could say, the bedrock of the story, the findings of the Warren Commission. Now, for anyone who's maybe, not as familiar, this was the official inquiry. It was established by President Johnson. And their 1964 report, that really laid the, initial framework for understanding the assassination.
Precisely. The Warren Commission ultimately concluded that President Kennedy was assassinated on November 22, 1963, in Dallas, Texas. And their investigation, determined that it was Lee Harvey Oswald, acting alone, who fired 3 shots from the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository.
Yeah.
And that 2 of those bullets, fatally struck the president.
Yeah, and the immediate aftermath was equally stunning. Oswald was apprehended the same day, but then just 2 days later, while being transferred, he was shot and killed by a nightclub owner, Jack Ruby. It's just incredible.
What's really interesting here is how the Warren Commission described Ruby's actions. They called it, and I quote, a patriotic act. But like you pointed out, the public largely reacted with skepticism. Oswald never had the chance to stand trial to offer his account. And his emphatic claim, I didn't shoot anybody, I'm just a patsy, it's really resonated through the years.
Exactly. And the absence of Oswald's testimony really created this void. This crucial piece of the narrative was missing right from the beginning. And that absence, understandably, fueled widespread doubt about that lone gunman theory and really kind of opened the floodgates for alternative theories that Oswald didn't act alone.
Indeed. A Gallup poll, actually, from just last year on the 60th anniversary, showed that a significant majority of Americans, around 2/3, they believe that others were involved. And, this persistent skepticism has given rise to so many conspiracy theories over the decades.
Yeah, and one of the most prominent involves the CIA. Oliver Stone's film, JFK, really brought this idea to, I guess you could say a much wider audience. It suggested that the agency orchestrated the assassination and the subsequent cover-up, supposedly because of, President Kennedy's potential shift in policy regarding the Vietnam War.
That film definitely made a significant impact culturally.
Yeah.
It prompted some serious questions about the official explanation and the idea that elements within the government might have acted against the president. I think that's a powerful and, for many, a really concerning possibility.
So that's kind of like the established context. I think we've set the stage pretty well. Now let's turn to why we're really here. These newly released documents. On March 18th, this huge batch of files was released. Over 2,000 PDFs, totaling, I think, around 63,400 pages, all became public. Mm-hmm. And this all followed an executive order back in January. So what insights have these documents actually offered?
Well, it's important, I think, to have realistic expectations here. Initial reviews have suggested that these documents haven't given us, any definitive groundbreaking revelations concerning the assassination itself. There isn't a single piece of evidence that just, suddenly resolves all the long-standing questions about, who was involved or the exact sequence of events.
Okay, so no, smoking gun. But what kind of information do these documents contain? What kind of picture are they starting to paint?
What's fascinating here is how much detail we get about the CIA's operations during the Cold War. It's much richer than what we had before. We're seeing specifics about their agents, the covert actions they undertook, even details about their budget. It really offers this window into, a very different era of global politics and intelligence gathering.
Can you give us like a specific example, something that really illustrates the nature of this new information? Like what kind of operation are we talking about?
Certainly. One document describes a covert operation where they contaminated this huge shipment of raw sugar. 80,000 bags of it. It was on its way from Cuba to the Soviet Union. Now, the contaminant wasn't harmful, I should say, but it did make the sugar taste incredibly bad, like basically ruined it for consumption. It really makes you think about how ingenious some of these Cold War tactics were.
Wow. That's certainly a creative way to mess with your adversary. It really gives you a sense of the kind of stuff that was going on, All this clandestine activity just below the surface of international relations.
It really does. And beyond these operational specifics, the documents have also revealed some surprising connections, personal connections actually, to the CIA. Individuals who, from the outside, were living ordinary lives. But secretly, they were engaged in intelligence work.
Yeah, that's the part that I find really fascinating, this idea of everyday people playing these hidden roles in this huge global power struggle. So can you share some of these specific stories that have emerged? Like, who are these people?
Absolutely. One compelling case is this guy named John Smith. He discovered that his grandfather, a professor at the University of Maryland, E.B. Smith was his name, was actually a secret asset for the CIA. This professor gathered intelligence, Soviet-era intelligence, and even questioned KGB officials about potential Soviet links to Oswald. Imagine finding that out about your own family.
Wow, that is wild. A university professor secretly working with the CIA, probing the Soviets about Oswald. Are there any other surprising connections that have been uncovered?
Yeah, definitely. We also have the story of Dorothy North. She's 76 years old now, and she just learned that her late husband, Robert North, was a CIA source during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He provided intelligence about Cuban exiles during that incredibly tense period.
So while the world was teetering on the brink of nuclear war, her husband was secretly feeding information to the CIA. That's pretty heavy stuff. It really personalizes these major events in a way that you wouldn't expect.
For sure. And then there's Mark Mills, 67 years old, who discovered that his father, Brian Mills, conducted these sensitive surveillance operations in Cuba. This included bugging a Chinese agency office in Havana after the Cuban Revolution. Not actually your average dad stuff.
Yeah, these personal stories definitely add a whole new dimension to our understanding of the Cold War and really bring the CIA's reach, into focus. But let's get back to that central question that I think is on a lot of people's minds. Did Oswald act alone? The Warren Commission said he did, but how does all this new information, even if it's not directly about the assassination itself, how does it affect that question for you?
Well, I think it raises a really crucial point. These documents don't overturn the Warren Commission's findings, and they don't, definitively prove a conspiracy, but they do highlight how intricate and often concealed the world of intelligence was back then. And like you mentioned earlier, the House Select Committee on Assassinations did suggest there could have been a conspiracy. So the official view has evolved somewhat over time. But ultimately, whether Oswald acted alone, it's still a question that's open for debate, and there's a lot of uncertainty around it.
And of course, the mystery surrounding Oswald himself is made even more, intriguing because of his death, just 2 days after the assassination. Can you just briefly remind us how that all unfolded?
So Lee Harvey Oswald was shot by Jack Ruby on November 24th, 1963. It happened in the basement of the Dallas police station. They were transferring him to a county jail. And the whole thing was broadcast live on television. So you can imagine, it just added another layer of shock and disbelief to this already unbelievable situation.
It's crazy to think about that, The accused assassin murdered on live TV before ever facing trial. And Ruby, he claimed he did it out of grief and anger over Kennedy's death. But of course, that event also gave rise to its own set of theories, about his true motive.
Of course, the idea that Ruby was acting on behalf of someone else, maybe to silence Oswald. That's been a recurring idea within these conspiracy theories. And Ruby was actually convicted of murder, but then he died of cancer while he was waiting for a retrial. It's just another, not in this incredibly complex and tragic story.
So as we kind of start to wrap up this deep dive for our listeners, what are the big takeaways here? What have we learned from these newly released JFK files?
I think the main takeaway is that while these documents give us this, fascinating and more detailed picture of the CIA during the Cold War, and have even revealed some pretty surprising connections, to the agency, they haven't given us definitive answers about Kennedy's assassination, Whether Oswald acted alone, that question is still unanswered for a lot of people, despite the Warren Commission's conclusion.
Yeah, it seems like the mystery of JFK's assassination is just like built to endure. These new pieces of information just keep adding fuel to the fire, and there are just so many different ways to interpret what happened in Dallas.
That's true. And I think all of this leads to a really interesting question for everyone listening, to consider. Given these new connections that we've seen, between everyday people and these clandestine CIA operations during the Cold War, how should we think about other major historical events? Events where maybe the official story has been questioned or scrutinized by the public? Makes you wonder, about all the stories that are still hidden.
It definitely does. Lots to think about. Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and until next time, keep those critical thinking caps on.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.